Eve Fairbanks' highly anticipated debut nonfiction, The Inheritors, has finally hit the shelves. The book flawlessly weaves together moving stories of three ordinary South Africans over 5 tumultuous decades. This is through a lens that focuses on a sweeping and exquisite look at what really happens when a country resolves to end white supremacy. Without giving much of the book away, let's now rope in its author, Eve Fairbanks, into this conversation. Eve, a very good morning. Thank you so much for joining us. Welcome.
Hi, thank you.
Now, this book is a dozen years in the making. Tell us about why it took so long to publish it.
Yeah, so I was born in the United States. I grew up in America. I moved in 2009 to Cape Town first. Then I lived in Bloemfontein, Thohoyandou, and I wanted to give a treatment in the book, if you read it, to we sometimes call it in journalism ordinary people. I don't like that word, but you know, people that you might have grown up with yourself. People, one of the main figures is an activist from Soweto. Another is someone who grew up on a farm north of Vryburg. Type of people that we, you know, normally we might give a rugby hero or a politician, this type of deep biography. But in this case, it's regular South Africans and the way that they live their lives. And it takes years to travel with people to the places where they grew up, to really get a feel for them, to learn about their stories, many years to do that type of reporting.
And what makes The Inheritors the perfect title for this story?
Yeah, it's an interesting question. I think, you know, when I got to South Africa, I had the sense that there was the hope that the country had a total reboot, which in some ways politically it did in 1994, that it was a kind of a blank slate. And yet that cut against things that many people were experiencing as they walked through their lives, lived their lives in the country, which was that there was a lot held over from the past, the near-term past, the long-term past, their own hopes, the way they'd grown up, the hopes that they'd grown up with, the fears, and that they really kind of found out belatedly or decided that they had to grapple with more in their middle of their lives.
Okay. Now, do unpack for us how this book subtly observes the truths about race and power that extend well beyond national borders.
Yeah. So, you know, there are lines about Americans, about American writers, some of which I think are fair, that, you know, when American journalists or American tourists, or they go anywhere, it's a kind of a solipsistic country that sees itself in any other nation. I think that South Africa and the US, they have a lot of very distinctive parallels. I sometimes feel that there's very few countries in history in the world that have so many kind of parallels between their history on race, their history on colonialism, their just kind of spirit, their sense that the country should be a redemptive project for its inhabitants. So I think that both of these countries, in terms of crossing national borders, reporting across cultures, have a lot to learn from each other. The US has a lot to learn from South Africa, but also vice versa. And some of those parallels are drawn out in very specific ways in the book.
Now,
that I think will be interesting for, you know, people who think we know our own history, we know American, you know, the American story, but what do these two countries have in common, and how do they differ? And, you know, how can that help us think about both societies?
Let's now extend our discussion then to, you know, the three main characters featured in this book and how you weaved in their stories in this wholesome book.
Yeah, I think when people start to read the book, they'll feel that it reads like a novel. It reads a little bit like fiction, which I hope is quite interesting, because it follows three main figures. It's all totally true. It's all nonfiction, deeply reported, but it has that kind of rich feel to it. Two of these people, who were people that I knew and know, were born right around 1970. So they're in their early 50s now. And I wanted to look at their lives because they were teenagers. They grew up thinking that they would live in a certain type of society and have a certain type of relationship to each other. And then right in their early 20s, that got flipped in some ways it didn't. And then Dipuo, who was a young activist in Soweto in the 1980s, as a teenager, on her 20th birthday in 1992, she gave birth to her only daughter, who is a member of what people know as the Born Free type generation, and was very active in Fees Must Fall. So you have a mother-daughter story at the heart of it too. So you have those three figures. The third is an Afrikaans man who grew up on a farm, and his life intersects right in the early 1990s in the border between downtown Joburg and Soweto, in terms of a place that both Dipuo and Christo had a certain type of thing happen in their lives that really turned their life on its head.
Yes. And, you know, I quite like how you explore the question of how we can let go of our pasts as individuals and as countries, yeah?
Yeah, I think in our own personal lives, a lot of us grapple with a central question of wanting to become the person that we feel we're meant to be, wanting to let go of certain inheritances from our family, from, you know, things that we were taught, both wanting to honor our parents and our families and live up to that, but also wanting to be a different type of person. And I think that can happen for a society and a country too. So you have a desire to move on, to move forward, to be different, and yet also often people come, you know, in their 30s or 40s to a realization that they have taken more with them than maybe they initially understood when they were younger. And how do we deal with that? And how do we look at that honestly and work with that?
Sure. And another key discussion perhaps is around historical debt and how that can be paid. Speak to us more about this.
Yeah, so there's a lot of very complex, I think, feelings that a book can be able to unpack in a way that an op-ed has a more difficult time doing, that I think over the course of a book, you can really kind of go back and forth on these sort of subtle ideas. And one thing that I talk about is, and I think, you know, it's unpacked in a lot of complexity in the book, but certainly some white South Africans that I knew had a feeling that they haven't yet paid. And I don't necessarily mean that in a woke way, but that there's the expectation that they might be dispossessed, that their life in the country might still get much harder, and that maybe that's deserved. Again, these are not always people who would agree that that's the moral thing. I talk about some more politically right-wing people in the book, but that's the expectation. And that there is this sort of ledger that's still unbalanced in South Africa in terms of, who has what, and kind of living with, and in some cases resisting, but wondering about, you know, how do we zero out that ledger in terms of who got what, whose ancestors got what, et cetera.
Oh. Wow, great chatting to you. Thank you so much for joining us, eh?
Thank you so much for having me.
Thank you, Eve. Well, that's our Sunday morning guest author, Eve Fairbanks, and we were in conversation with her about her book titled The Inheritors.